Drop that file, Maid. The command cracked through the marble hallway so sharply that even the string quartet in the ballroom missed a note. Grace Miller stopped mid-step, both hands wrapped around a rain-soaked brown envelope pressed tightly against the front of her housekeeping apron. Water from her sleeves dripped onto the polished floor in tiny dark circles. At the top of the staircase stood Eleanor Whitmore, silver gown flawless, diamonds cold against her throat, one hand resting on the banister like it belonged there more than gravity itself. Behind her, a dozen guests turned in slow curiosity, crystal glasses hovering near painted smiles. Grace looked small beneath the chandelier light, 5'4" in worn black shoes, uniform hem damp from the storm outside, but she did not move. 30 seconds earlier, she had been replacing hand towels in the east foyer restroom when the front gate buzzer screamed twice, then went silent. She opened the service door and found an elderly man kneeling in the rain beside the hedges, coat torn at the sleeve, breath shaking. His white hair clung to his forehead. He looked less like a wealthy guest and more like someone who had outrun fear for miles. Before Grace could ask if he needed an ambulance, he pushed the envelope into her hands. "Don't let them take this," he whispered. Then his eyes rolled back, and he slumped sideways onto the stone path. Grace shouted for help. No one came. Music from the charity gala swallowed her voice. So she did the only thing she knew to do. She dragged a patio blanket over the man, lifted the envelope, and ran inside to call security. But now security stood 10 feet away beside Eleanor, waiting for orders. "I said drop it," Eleanor repeated, descending one slow step at a time. Her heels clicked like a countdown. "That belongs to my guest." Grace swallowed. "Ma'am," a man collapsed outside. "He told me not to let anyone take this." A few people laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because rich rooms often laughed when poor people spoke too long. Eleanor's expression hardened by a degree. "And now the help is taking instructions from strangers?" She glanced toward the guests. "This is what happens when boundaries disappear." A man in a navy tuxedo smirked into his drink. Another woman whispered, "Did she steal it?" Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her grip tightened instead of loosening. The envelope was heavier than paper should have been. Something solid rested inside. Maybe files, maybe a flash drive, maybe trouble. She had spent enough years cleaning expensive homes to recognize one truth. Wealthy people only panicked over money or secrets. "I didn't steal anything," Grace said quietly. "He asked me to protect it." Eleanor reached the final stair and stopped inches away. Perfume, expensive and sharp, cut through the scent of rainwater on Grace's clothes. "People like you always confuse being near important things with being important yourselves." The room went still. Even the violinists lowered their bows. Grace had heard versions of that sentence her whole life. In stores, in offices, in school hallways where polished shoes never touched the floor the same way hers did. But tonight something inside her refused to bend. She lifted her chin. "With respect, ma'am, I'm trying to return it to the right person." A murmur moved through the crowd. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. She was not used to resistance arriving in housekeeping shoes. Two men in tailored suits entered from the side corridor, both dry despite the storm, both scanning the room too quickly. One of them locked onto the envelope at once. "There it is," he said. Not to Grace. To Eleanor. Grace noticed that. She also noticed the flicker that crossed Eleanor's face before it disappeared. "Tiny. Fast. Real. Give it here," the second man said, extending a hand polished by confidence. "We'll handle it." Grace stepped back one pace. Her heel touched the base of the staircase. "Who are you?" she asked. The first man smiled without warmth. "Friends of the owner." Outside, thunder rolled across the estate grounds, rattling the window panes. Somewhere beyond the glass, the old man lay in the rain. Grace could still hear his voice. "Don't let them take this." Security shifted closer. Guests leaned in. Crystal chandeliers burned above them like frozen fire. Eleanor held out her hand, palm open, patient now, dangerous in a quieter way. "Last chance, Grace." Grace looked at the hand, then at the two suited men, then toward the front doors where rain streaked down the glass in silver lines. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had no money, no power, no witness who would choose her over them. Only instinct. Only conscience. Only the strange certainty that the truth was standing in the room wearing the cheapest shoes. She tucked the envelope tighter under her arm and said the one thing no one there expected to hear. No. The word hung in the air longer than thunder. No one in the Whitmore mansion seemed prepared for. A maid to say it. Grace Miller heard her own heartbeat in the silence that followed. Eleanor Whitmore lowered her outstretched hand very slowly, as if refusing to believe someone in a pressed housekeeping uniform had denied her in front of donors, board members, and neighbors who measured status the way jewelers measured diamonds. The two men in tailored suits exchanged a glance sharp enough to cut glass. One stepped forward first. He was tall, silver tie perfectly centered, shoes dry despite the storm outside. "Miss, you do not understand what you are holding." Grace kept the envelope tucked beneath her arm. "Then explain it." The man smiled politely, but nothing in his eyes moved. "Private. Legal material." Grace looked toward the front doors. Rain streamed down the panes in silver sheets. Somewhere outside, an elderly man lay under a patio blanket because no one in this house had helped him. "If it is so private," she said, "why was he alone in the rain?" Several guests shifted uncomfortably. A woman near the piano lowered her glass. Another man pretended to check his phone. Eleanor turned toward security. "Escort her to the staff office." Now, two guards stepped closer, not rough, not aggressive, but certain. Grace knew that certainty. It was the confidence of people who had never been questioned by anyone wearing less expensive clothes than theirs. She backed one pace, then another, until the grand staircase rail touched her elbow. "I will hand it over after someone calls an ambulance," she said. "The man outside needs help." "He has already left," said the second suited man. His answer came too quickly. Grace stared at him. "That is impossible." He adjusted his cufflinks. "Then perhaps you were mistaken." Grace felt the room tilt. She had seen the man collapse. She had heard the fear in his voice. She had felt his fingers tremble when he pushed the envelope into her hands. Poor people were often told their eyes had imagined what powerful people wished undone. She had learned that lesson young. At 12 years old, she watched a store clerk follow her mother through every aisle, then claim it was standard policy. At 19, she was told a promotion had gone to someone more polished. At 28, she cleaned homes where owners spoke about her as if she were furniture. But tonight the lie stood too close to the truth to hide its smell. "Then let me see the cameras," Grace said. Gasps fluttered through the ballroom like startled birds. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "You are in no position to demand anything." "No, ma'am," Grace answered softly. "But I am in a position to notice when something is wrong." The string quartet had stopped completely now. For musicians sat motionless beside their stands, bows lowered, as if even music knew better than to interrupt this moment. Eleanor moved nearer until only inches separated them. "You forget where you are." "No," Grace said. "I know exactly where I am." That sentence landed harder than a shout. Because it was true. She stood in a mansion built on old money and newer silence. She stood in a room where charity banners hung beside people who could not bear inconvenience. She stood in front of a woman praised in magazines for generosity while refusing to call for help for a man outside her own gate. One of the guests, a younger man in a charcoal tuxedo, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, maybe someone should check outside." Eleanor did not look at him. "Mind your place, Daniel." The room noticed that too. Grace noticed everything now. The first suited man took another step. "Miss Miller, let us be practical. Give us the envelope and tonight ends quietly." "Quietly for who?" Grace asked. His smile disappeared. "Security." Reached for her elbow. Grace did not fight. She simply shifted and held the envelope higher, away from their hands. In that movement, the flap loosened for half a second. A silver flash drive slid halfway into view, clipped to a stack of papers stamped with a seal she recognized from television news. United States District Court. The first suited man lunged forward with sudden urgency, then caught himself before anyone could call it desperation. Too late. Everyone had seen it. Murmurs spread through the ballroom. Eleanor's face lost a shade of color beneath the chandelier light. Grace pushed the flash drive back inside and sealed the flap with her palm. "So it is not just party invitations," she said. Thunder rolled again, closer this time. Then from the front entrance came 3 hard knocks against the massive doors. Not the polite ring of wealthy guests. Not the tap of service staff. 3 deliberate knocks that carried authority. Every head turned. One of the guards hesitated. The butler hurried across the marble floor, opened the door, and cold rain-washed air rushed inside. On the steps stood a uniformed paramedic, 2 police officers, and behind them, drenched but upright, the elderly man Grace had covered with a blanket. His white hair clung to his forehead. His breathing was steadier now. His eyes found Grace immediately. Then he pointed directly at the 2 suited men and said, in a voice stronger than before, "Those are the men who tried to steal my evidence." Those words hit the ballroom harder than the thunder outside. No one moved for a full second. Crystal glasses stayed frozen in midair. The violinists remained seated like statues. Rain blew through the open doorway and scattered cold droplets across the marble floor, but the room seemed to feel only one thing now: exposure. The 2 suited men who had carried themselves with polished confidence moments earlier suddenly looked ordinary. One took a careful step backward. The other forced a smile that no longer fit his face. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. The elderly man entered slowly between the police officers, one hand resting on the paramedic's arm for balance. His coat was damp, but his eyes were steady. "No," he replied, voice rough but clear. "The misunderstanding is that you believed no one here would help me." He looked at Grace. Except her. Grace felt every gaze in the room turn at once. Not the invisible glances servants learned to ignore. These were direct, searching, unsettled. The kind people gave when the story they had written in their minds was suddenly wrong. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the staircase, posture straight, fingers lightly touching the rail, but the color had drained from her face. "Samuel?" she said quietly. The old man nodded once. "Yes, Eleanor. Still alive. Still inconvenient." A murmur passed through the guests. Some recognized the name immediately. Samuel Reed had once been one of the most respected consumer protection attorneys in the state, the kind of man who sued banks, developers, and corporations that counted on ordinary people being too tired or too poor to fight back. For 3 years he had vanished from public life. Rumors said illness. Others said retirement. None of those rumors mentioned fear. Officer Martinez, broad-shouldered and calm, stepped forward. "Sir, are these the individuals you identified in your call?" Samuel raised his hand and pointed directly at the 2 men. "Yes, they followed me from downtown. They attempted to take the file after I left the courthouse annex." The first man laughed too quickly. "Officer, this is absurd. We represent private interests tied to this matter." "Then you can explain that downtown," Martinez said. The smile disappeared. Guests began to retreat by instinct, creating distance the way tides leave sharp rocks exposed. Phones appeared discreetly in hands. Whispered names traveled from one corner of the room to another. Grace remained where she was, the envelope still tucked under her arm, though now it felt less like a burden and more like a key she had not known she carried. Samuel turned toward her again. "Miss, did they pressure you to hand it over?" Grace answered honestly. "They asked politely first." A few nervous laughs escaped the room, then died quickly. Samuel's lined face softened for the first time. "You did better than many judges I have known." Eleanor took 2 measured steps forward. "Samuel, if there is some legal issue involving my guests, I had no knowledge of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "That may be true." Her shoulders lowered half an inch in relief. Then he added, "But ignorance has become fashionable in rooms like this." Several donors looked suddenly fascinated by the ceiling. The second suited man tried another angle. "Mrs. Whitmore, surely you understand reputational damage. If this becomes a scene, it became a scene when you chased an old man through a storm," Samuel said. "It became a scandal when you mistook a maid for someone who would betray herself cheaply." Grace lowered her eyes for a second, not from shame, but because praise felt unfamiliar in rooms like this. She had spent years hearing what she lacked. Education she did not have. Accent she should soften. Hair she should tame. Neighborhood she should leave behind. Tonight a man with power named what she possessed instead. Character. Officer Martinez extended a hand. "Miss Miller, may I take custody of the envelope as evidence?" Before Grace could answer, Samuel lifted his palm gently. "One moment." He approached her slowly, shoes leaving damp prints on the marble. Up close, he looked exhausted, but there was iron beneath it. "Would you hand it to me directly?" he asked. Grace studied him. Fear still lived in the edges of his breath, but truth lived in his eyes. She passed him the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted it. He opened the flap just enough to check the contents. then exhaled as if air had been denied to him for hours. Everything is here. Eleanor spoke again, voice tighter now. Everything is where? Samuel looked across the ballroom at her guests, then back at her. Inside this envelope are contracts, payment ledgers, and recorded communications tied to a land acquisition scheme that displaced hundreds of families across 3 counties. The room fell colder than the rain outside. And before anyone asks, he continued, yes, some of your charitable partners are named in it. A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the marble. No one even turned. Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. Grace watched the powerful discover what helplessness felt like. Samuel faced her once more. Miss Miller, do you know why 10 lawyers will be here in the morning? She shook her head. He gave the faintest smile. Because after tonight, everyone will want to know the name of the woman who protected the truth when money could not. Then he glanced toward Eleanor Whitmore and delivered the final cut with perfect calm. And because some of them will be coming for this house. The sentence lingered after Samuel Reed spoke, hanging over the ballroom like smoke after lightning. Some guests quietly set their glasses down as if crystal had suddenly become too loud. Others stepped farther from Eleanor Whitmore without seeming to move at all, the subtle retreat of people who knew headlines could stain expensive names. Eleanor stood perfectly still near the staircase, but Grace noticed the tiny tremor in the hand resting against the polished rail. It was the first human thing Grace had seen from her all night. Officer Martinez signaled to his partner, and the 2 suited men were guided toward the foyer. Their protests had changed tone now. Less confidence. More urgency. You cannot do this in front of witnesses, one said. Martinez answered without emotion. That is exactly where I prefer to do it. The front doors closed behind them, shutting out the rain and leaving only the softer sound of storm water tapping the tall windows. Inside, the mansion felt smaller than before. Samuel held the envelope against his chest and turned slowly toward Eleanor. You hosted a charity gala for housing justice tonight, he asked. No one missed the irony. Eleanor straightened. My foundation raises millions every year. Then perhaps it can start by returning what was taken. Her jaw tightened. If anyone used my name or property without consent, I will address it. Samuel studied her face. Would you like to know whether they did? She did not answer immediately. Grace understood why. Truth often arrived expensive. Finally, Eleanor said, yes. Samuel nodded once. Then clear the room. Guests glanced at one another. Some seemed offended to be dismissed. Others were relieved to escape. Within minutes, tuxedos and gowns drifted toward exits, murmuring into phones, gathering coats, preserving versions of the story that made them look wise for leaving early. The musicians packed their instruments in silence. The champagne towers still glowed beneath chandelier light, untouched now, like monuments to bad timing. Grace turned to slip quietly toward the service hallway. She had no reason to remain in the center of rich people's consequences. Miss Miller, Samuel called gently. She paused. Please stay. Eleanor looked at Grace, and for the first time there was no command in her eyes. Only discomfort. Yes, she said quietly. Stay. Grace remained near the wall, hands folded in front of her damp apron. The room emptied until only 5 people remained. Samuel, Eleanor, Grace, Officer Martinez, and the butler, Mr. Hawthorne, who stood near the doorway with the posture of a man who had witnessed decades and commented on none of them. Samuel placed the envelope on a side table and removed the silver flash drive. It caught the chandelier light like a blade. 3 years ago, he began, a development group acquired land across Brookhaven, Mill Creek, and East Parish. Families were pressured to sell below market value. Some were threatened with code violations. Others were told roads would cut through their homes if they refused. Eleanor frowned. I know those projects. We donated relocation grants. You donated blankets after setting the fire, Samuel said. She recoiled as if struck by words alone. Grace felt the room go colder. Samuel continued. Your foundation was listed publicly as a philanthropic partner. That gave legitimacy to the acquisitions. Donations soothed outrage. Press releases softened scrutiny. Eleanor's voice dropped. I signed ceremonial letters. My legal office handled partnerships. And they selected partners who used your reputation as cover. He tapped the flash drive. These files contain internal messages, shell company payments, and board approvals routed through advisors tied to tonight's guests. Eleanor sank slowly onto the edge of a velvet chair. Her gown pooled around her like silver. Water. No, she whispered, though not to Samuel. To herself. Grace watched the transformation carefully. Pride did not disappear all at once. It cracked in quiet places first. Samuel turned toward Grace. Do you know where Brookhaven is? She nodded. South Side, near Route 18. Did you ever live there? Grace hesitated. My grandmother did. Samuel's eyes softened. Then you should know this. Her block was one of the first taken. Grace felt the breath leave her chest. She pictured her grandmother's tiny porch, chipped white paint, tomato plants in coffee cans, Sunday hymns drifting through screen windows. Sold after taxes rose suddenly. Moved into an apartment where sunlight never found the kitchen. That was them, she asked. Samuel nodded. In part. Grace looked at Eleanor. The older woman stared at the floor, diamonds dim now, shoulders bent beneath a weight money could not lift. I did not know, Eleanor said. Grace answered before she meant to. People like us always know when something is taken. Silence followed. Even Officer Martinez lowered his gaze. Eleanor looked up slowly, meeting Grace's eyes fully for the first time. No dismissal, no distance, just shame. Miss Miller, she said, voice thin and unsteady. I spoke to you disgracefully. Grace did not rescue her from the moment. Samuel inserted the flash drive into a laptop on the sideboard. Rows of files opened across the screen, contracts, maps, payment trails, names. One folder sat at the top labeled Whitmore Primary Residence. Eleanor stood so abruptly the chair legs scraped marble. What is that? Samuel's expression hardened. The next phase. They intended to leverage your estate as collateral through forged authorizations once the scandal surfaced. If exposed, you would lose the house and carry the blame. Grace stared at the screen, then at Eleanor. The woman who had humiliated her hours ago had nearly been ruined by the very people she trusted. Samuel closed the laptop gently. That is why 10 lawyers will arrive in the morning, he said. Some to defend you, some to destroy you. All because one maid refused to hand over an envelope. Then Eleanor Whitmore, owner of the mansion, stepped toward Grace Miller, lowered her head, and said the two words no one in that house had ever expected to hear from her. Help me. Help me. The words sounded almost unreal in the Whitmore ballroom, as if the mansion itself rejected them. Grace Miller stood motionless near the wall, damp uniform cooling against her skin, while Eleanor Whitmore faced her with lowered eyes and trembling hands. Hours earlier that same hand had pointed, dismissed, commanded. Now it reached with nothing in it. Grace had imagined many endings to humiliating nights in wealthy homes. Quiet resignation, lost wages, a bus ride home in wet shoes. She had never imagined being asked for help by the woman who owned the marble beneath her feet. Samuel Reed watched carefully, but said nothing. He knew some silences had to earn their own answers. Officer Martinez remained by the doorway, posture neutral, while Mr. Hawthorne the butler stood so still he seemed carved from the woodwork. Grace looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Pride still clung to the older woman like perfume, but fear had entered the room and changed the scent. What exactly do you want from me? Grace asked. Eleanor swallowed. I want to know what to do next. Grace almost laughed, not from cruelty, but from disbelief. The woman with 4 attorneys on retainer, 3 homes, and a foundation printed in glossy magazines was asking a maid what came next. Samuel answered for her. The truth usually comes next, whether we welcome it or not. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Then start there. Samuel gestured toward the dining salon adjoining the ballroom. We need a table, coffee, every document your office keeps on Brookhaven, Mill Creek, and East Parish, and no one enters unless I approve it. Mr. Hawthorne nodded once and moved with swift efficiency. Grace noticed how quickly the household responded when command came from principle instead of vanity. Within 15 minutes the gala lights were dimmed, candles extinguished, and the grand dining table transformed from a place of plated luxury into a war room of folders, laptops, and legal pads. Outside, rain softened to a steady whisper against the windows. Inside, another storm began. Eleanor changed from her silver gown into a plain cream sweater and dark slacks. Without jewels and camera-ready posture, she looked older and strangely smaller. Grace would not have believed how much costume wealth required until seeing it removed. Samuel sat at the head of the 30-foot table, reading contracts through wire-rimmed glasses Mr. Hawthorne had fetched from a guest suite. Officer Martinez coordinated calls from one end, occasionally stepping outside to update investigators. Grace stood uncertainly near the sideboard until Samuel pointed to an empty chair beside him. "Sit, Miss Miller. You know more than you think." She hesitated. "I clean tables like this. I do not belong at them." Samuel looked directly at her. That sentence built half the corruption in this country. "Sit anyway." Grace sat. The wood felt cold beneath her forearms. Eleanor slid a folder across the table. "These are donation summaries tied to relocation grants." Grace opened the file. Numbers, signatures, addresses. She frowned. "These names repeat." Samuel glanced over. "Which names?" Grace pointed. "Different neighborhoods, same recipients. Same handwriting on multiple forms too." Eleanor leaned in sharply. "How did I miss that?" Grace answered without malice. "Because you were reading totals. I was reading people." The room fell quiet. Samuel smiled faintly. "And that, Mrs. Whitmore, is why I asked her to stay." More files opened. More patterns emerged. Grants promised, but never mailed. Maintenance invoices billed to homes already demolished. Legal notices sent to vacant lots. Every page revealed a machine that assumed ordinary families would never be heard. Grace's chest tightened as street names surfaced that she knew by memory. Her grandmother's church. The grocery where they cashed checks. The corner barber who gave free trims before school pictures. Reduced now to line items and acquisition phases. Eleanor noticed the change in Grace's face. "Your family was there?" Grace nodded once. "My grandmother lost her porch before she lost her health." Eleanor lowered her gaze. "I am sorry." Grace did not answer right away. Apologies were easy when spoken indoors after damage was complete. Then Samuel opened another folder, and the air changed again. Inside were draft statements prepared for media release if scandal broke. Eleanor's name topped each page. She scanned the text, lips parting in shock. "These statements blame me entirely." "Yes," Samuel said. "Your advisors built a parachute using your body." She stared at the words. "Philanthropist misled by rogue vendors. Owner accepts full responsibility. Asset liquidation expected." Grace could see the moment Eleanor understood loneliness at the top. All the polished dinners, all the smiling partners, all the handshakes and photographs had prepared her for one thing: abandonment. "Can this be stopped?" Eleanor whispered. Samuel folded his hands. "Yes, but dawn is 6 hours away, and 10 lawyers arrive at 8. Some represent justice. Some represent sharks. They will smell blood before they ring the bell." Grace looked toward the tall windows where the rain had begun to clear. Beyond the glass, the lawn lamps glowed over wet stone paths where this night had started with an old man collapsing in the dark. Strange how quickly worlds turned. Eleanor looked at Grace again, this time without title or distance. "You saw what I could not. Will you help me fix what I ignored?" Grace thought of every slight she had swallowed for rent money. Every room she cleaned where people stepped around her voice. She thought of her grandmother folding tax notices with shaking hands. She thought of how easy revenge would feel for one warm second. Then she thought of something harder. "Better. I will help the families," she said. "Whether that helps you depends on what truth costs by morning." Samuel nodded once. "Good answer." Mr. Hawthorne entered quietly carrying fresh coffee and a stack of sealed envelopes from Eleanor's private office. He set them down, then paused. "Ma'am," he said to Eleanor, "there is one more matter." She looked up. "What now?" The butler's face remained calm, but his eyes sharpened toward the front drive. "The first lawyer has arrived early." The first lawyer has arrived early. Those 7 words changed the temperature of the room more than the storm ever had. Eleanor Whitmore pushed back from the table so quickly her chair legs scraped the hardwood floor. Grace looked toward the tall front windows where dawn had only begun to gray the sky. It was barely after 6 o'clock. If one had come early, others would not be far behind. Samuel Reed closed the folder in front of him with deliberate calm. "Who is it?" he asked. Mr. Hawthorne adjusted his cuffs. "Mr. Victor Langley, sir." Eleanor's face tightened. "No." Grace had never heard a single syllable carry so much history. Samuel leaned back. "Former counsel?" "Former friend," Eleanor said. "Current opportunist." Hawthorne nodded once. He says he is here to protect your interests. Samuel gave a dry smile. Then bolt the silverware. Eleanor paced to the window and looked down the circular drive. A black sedan waited below, polished enough to reflect the waking sky. Beside it stood a tall man in a charcoal overcoat, umbrella closed, hands folded behind his back as if he owned patience itself. Grace noticed something in Eleanor's posture she had not seen before. Not anger, not arrogance. Recognition. He helped build the foundation, Eleanor said quietly. He introduced me to half the board. He drafted every partnership I did not personally review. Then he knows where every body is buried, Samuel replied, and exactly where to stand when they rise. Grace remained seated, hands around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm. The night had stretched into morning without her noticing. Candles had burned low. Contracts covered the 30-foot table like battlefield maps. Her damp shoes had long since dried, leaving faint marks on the floor beneath her chair. She should have been exhausted, yet something sharper than fatigue kept her awake. She was watching power rearrange itself in real time. Mr. Hawthorne spoke again. He also brought 2 associates and a portable scanner. Samuel laughed once, quietly. Predators travel prepared. Eleanor turned from the window. If I refuse to see him, he will assume weakness. If you rush to see him, he will confirm leverage, Samuel said. Either way, he came early because he wants you alone before the others arrive. Grace listened carefully. Wolf had. Lawyers the way neighborhoods had weather. You learned to read warning signs, or got flooded. Then do not meet him alone, she said. Both Eleanor and Samuel looked at her. Grace set down the mug. Men like that count doors before they knock. If he came early, he expects panic. Do not give him private panic. Samuel's eyes warmed with approval. Again, he said softly, she reads people. Eleanor inhaled slowly, steadied herself, and nodded. Fine. We meet him here. At the table. Hawthorne moved to obey, but Samuel raised a hand. One more thing. He turned to Grace. Miss Miller, would you stay in the room? She blinked. Me? Especially you. Eleanor looked surprised for only a moment, then thoughtful. Samuel continued. Victor Langley came for signatures, silence, or surrender. Let him face the person who ruined his schedule. Grace almost smiled. 10 minutes later, the dining salon had changed again. Extra folders were stacked neatly. The laptop screens were angled away. Fresh coffee steamed beside untouched pastries no one wanted. Dawn light slipped through the east windows in pale bands, turning dust in the air to drifting gold. Grace stood near the sideboard in her housekeeping uniform, apron still tied, posture straight. She had never felt less invisible in servant clothes. The doors opened. Victor Langley entered with the polished confidence of a man who billed by the hour and believed every room improved when he stepped into it. He was in his late 50s, silver at the temples, smile measured, eyes restless. 2 younger associates followed carrying cases and tablets. His gaze landed first on Eleanor, then on Samuel, then paused when he saw Grace. A flicker, brief, calculating. Eleanor, he said warmly, as though arriving for brunch instead of crisis. I came the moment I heard rumors. You came before sunrise, Eleanor replied. That is not concern. That is appetite. His smile widened without softening. Still sharp, he nodded toward Samuel. And Samuel read, I had heard you were retired. People say many foolish things when they cannot find me, Samuel answered. Victor's eyes moved to Grace again. And housekeeping joined strategic meetings now. The old room might have laughed with him. This room did not. Grace met his gaze. Only when cleaning up other people's messes. One of the associates coughed to hide a grin. Victor's smile thinned. He set a leather folder on the table and opened it with elegant fingers. Eleanor, the situation is manageable if handled immediately. I have prepared temporary asset transfers, a media shield statement, and emergency powers granting me authority to negotiate on your behalf. Samuel did not even glance at the papers. How efficient. You arrived carrying her surrender already notarized. Victor ignored him. Sign before 8 o'clock, and we contain exposure. Eleanor did not sit. Exposure to whom? Investigators. Creditors. Press. Plaintiffs. He leaned closer. Friends become practical during scandal. Grace watched his hands. Smooth hands. Still hands. But his right thumb rubbed the edge of the folder repeatedly. Nervousness disguised as polish. He needed something signed fast. What do you gain? She asked. Victor turned slowly. I beg your pardon. When frightened people sign papers quickly, Grace said, someone usually profits. What is your share? Silence. The younger associates looked at the floor. Samuel smiled openly now. Eleanor's eyes narrowed as if seeing an old portrait under new light. Victor straightened. This is absurd. I do not answer financial questions from staff. Grace replied softly. Then answer them from witnesses. Outside, tires rolled over wet gravel. Another vehicle entered the drive. Then another. Hawthorne stepped to the window and looked down. Ma'am, he said, voice calm but urgent. There are 9 more cars behind him. There are 9 more cars behind him. The words landed like a gavel. Victor Langley did not turn toward the window right away, but Grace saw the small shift in his jaw. Men who planned surprises disliked being surprised themselves. Eleanor Whitmore moved first. She walked to the head of the 30-foot table and rested both palms on the polished wood. Dawn light spilled across the room in pale stripes, catching the tiredness beneath her eyes and the steadiness newly forming in them. Then let them all come in, she said. Mr. Hawthorne inclined his head and left without another word. Through the front drive windows, black sedans curved in one after another over wet gravel, engines quiet, doors opening in disciplined sequence. Grace had never seen power arrive in a line before. It looked less glamorous than movies promised, more like weather. Victor recovered quickly and buttoned his coat. Eleanor, this is exactly why you need immediate representation. Samuel Reed folded his hands. She has representation. Victor glanced at him with thin amusement. You are one attorney. Samuel's eyes did not blink. I brought 9 friends. Grace almost laughed, but the room was too sharp for laughter. Within minutes the doors opened, and the first arrivals entered the dining salon. Women and men in dark suits, winter coats, leather briefcases, tablets in hand. Some gray-haired, some young, all alert. They carried no performance, only purpose. Mr. Hawthorne guided them in with the calm of a maitre d' seating a very dangerous breakfast. The lead woman stepped forward first, tall, composed, late 40s, navy suit tailored with precision. Margaret Sloan, she said. State Ethics Commission, Special Counsel. She nodded once to Samuel. You always choose dramatic venues. Samuel replied. You always arrive on time. Behind her came a broad-shouldered man with silver glasses. David Chun, Federal Civil Fraud Task Force. Then a younger woman with warm eyes and stacks of files. Naomi Brooks, Class Action Counsel for Brookhaven residents. One by one the names continued until all 10 stood inside the room. Grace realized these were not 10 lawyers coming for one person. They were 10 different storms aimed at 10 different truths. Victor Langley's confidence thinned with each introduction. He attempted charm. Colleagues, perhaps we can coordinate privately before assumptions damage reputations. Margaret Sloan looked at him as one might look at a stain. Mr. Langley, your reputation arrived separately. 2 of the younger attorneys moved to the sideboard and began organizing evidence. Tablets opened. Folders spread. Extension cords appeared from nowhere. The mansion dining salon became a command center before Grace's eyes. Wealth decorated rooms. Competence transformed them. Eleanor remained standing. I want this understood immediately, she said, voice clear. If crimes were committed using my name, I want every responsible party exposed, including anyone in this house, on my payroll, or at this table. Victor's smile vanished completely. Careful, he said quietly. Statements made in panic create liability. Grace spoke before anyone else could. Silence created most of it. Several heads turned toward her. Not dismissively. Respectfully. Naomi Brooks approached Grace with a legal pad. You are Miss Miller? Grace nodded. Naomi extended her hand. My clients may still have homes because of you. Grace shook it carefully, unsure what to do with gratitude from strangers. I just held an envelope. Naomi smiled. Most people drop them when rich men ask nicely. Margaret Sloan opened a file and addressed Victor. We have billing records showing shell companies routed through Langley Advisory Holdings. Victor's expression did not move, but his color did. Routine consulting structures. David Chin placed a printed chart on the table. Arrows connected entities, trusts, nonprofits, development firms. Victor's name appeared repeatedly. Routine enough to collect $12 million in 18 months, Chin said. Eleanor stared at the chart as if it were written in a language she hated understanding. You told me those fees funded community outreach. Victor finally lost patience. And what did you think your galas were? Redemption with appetizers? The insult hung in the air. Grace watched Eleanor absorb it. Pain first, then clarity. Samuel spoke softly. There he is. Victor turned sharply. You self-righteous relic. Samuel only smiled. Truth saves time. Thank you. Margaret Sloane nodded to two investigators at the doorway. Mr. Langley, remain available. Do not leave the property. He laughed once, brittle and short. You cannot detain me over accounting disputes. Chun slid another folder forward. Forgery can accelerate matters. Eleanor looked up sharply. Forgery. Naomi opened to a signed authorization page bearing Eleanor's name. This signature approved collateral exposure of your residence. Grace saw Eleanor's fingers tighten against the table edge. I never signed that. Victor said nothing. That silence said enough. The room shifted around him like tide abandoning a stranded boat. Grace thought back to the moment he dismissed her as staff. How quickly titles expired when facts entered the room. Margaret Sloane turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Whitmore, we will need full cooperation, financial access, and sworn testimony. Eleanor answered without hesitation. You have it. Then she looked at Grace. And before anything else, everyone here should know whose courage started this. 10 attorneys, federal counsel, investigators, and Samuel Reed all turned toward the woman still wearing a housekeeping apron. Grace wanted to disappear on instinct, but there was nowhere to disappear to anymore. Samuel rose slowly from his chair. Record this clearly, he said. At approximately 11:42 last night, Grace Miller refused intimidation, protected evidence, exposed fraud, and likely saved hundreds of families from permanent loss. Naomi Brooks added, including mine. My grandmother was in Brookhaven. Grace's throat tightened. Across the room, Victor Langley stared at her as if trying to understand how someone he never counted had become the number that broke him. Then Mr. Hawthorne re-entered carrying a fresh envelope sealed in ivory paper. He approached Grace directly. Miss Miller, he said, voice steady. This arrived from the board courier 5 minutes ago. It is addressed only to you. It is addressed only to you. The room went still in a new way. Not the silence of scandal, but the silence of attention. Grace Miller looked at the ivory envelope in Mr. Hawthorne's gloved hand as if it belonged to someone else. Her own name, written in dark blue ink across the front, seemed too formal to be real. She had seen elegant stationery before while dusting desks and sorting outgoing mail, but never with her name on it. Who sent it? She asked quietly. Hawthorne glanced toward the wax seal. Whitmore Foundation Board office, miss. Every eye in the room shifted toward Eleanor. She looked just as surprised as anyone else. I did not authorize that, she said. Samuel Reed leaned back in his chair. Then perhaps someone else finally learned how mornings work. Grace accepted the envelope carefully. The paper was thick, expensive, almost warm from Hawthorne's hand. She hesitated. Open it, Naomi Brooks said softly. Grace broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter on embossed stationery and a smaller card beneath it. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the page. She read the first line once, then again, then looked up in disbelief. What is it? Eleanor asked. Grace swallowed. It says the emergency board met by conference call at 6:15 this morning. Margaret Sloane raised an eyebrow. Efficient panic. Grace continued reading aloud, voice careful and slow. In recognition of extraordinary integrity demonstrated in protection of Foundation interests and public trust, Miss Grace Miller is hereby offered the interim position of Community Recovery Director, effective immediately, pending acceptance. She stopped. The words seemed too large to fit in the room. Victor Langley gave a short, bitter laugh from the far end of the table. Public Relations Theater. Samuel did not look at him. Even theater can tell the truth accidentally. Grace stared at the second page. Salary, $180,000 annually. Her voice nearly failed on the number. She had spent years measuring life in hourly wages, bus fare, grocery coupons, and overtime shifts. $180,000 sounded less like money than another country. Eleanor stepped closer. There is more. Grace lifted the card. A signing authority request to establish a restitution fund for displaced families. Naomi covered her mouth with one hand. Samuel smiled openly now. Now that is useful theater. Grace lowered the papers. I'm not qualified for this. It was the most honest sentence she had spoken all morning. Margaret Sloane shook her head. You identified fraud patterns in 20 minutes. Naomi added. You understood community damage before any of us arrived. David Chun said. You refused pressure from men with more resources than conscience. Qualifications come in many forms. Grace looked at Eleanor last. The older woman met her eyes without defense. I once hired executives for confidence and polished resumes, Eleanor said quietly. Last night, I learned the cost of that habit. She took a slow breath. If you accept, I will support the decision publicly and answer to you where families were harmed under my name. Grace had no script for moments like this. Poor people were trained to survive emergencies, not opportunities. She thought of her grandmother clipping coupons under a kitchen bulb. She thought of carrying cleaning buckets past portraits worth more than her yearly pay. She thought of being told to know her place. Samuel watched her kindly. Miss Miller, positions like this are often given to those least suited for them. You being uncertain may be the strongest qualification in the room. Even a few attorneys laughed softly at that. Victor Langley remained silent now, shrinking by degrees no tailor could fix. Grace looked back at the letter. Community Recovery Director. The title sounded impossible. Yet, so had saying no in a ballroom full of wealth. If I accept, she said slowly, I want conditions. Margaret Sloane smiled. There she is. Grace lifted one finger. First, every family in Brookhaven, Mill Creek, and East Parish gets independent review. A second finger. Second, no relocation check can be delayed by committees or image concerns. A third. Third, I choose the outreach team from people who actually know those neighborhoods. Naomi's eyes shined. Done. Eleanor nodded immediately. Done. Grace looked toward Victor. And fourth, no one who profited from their suffering advises anything ever again. Even Chen laughed at that one. Victor's face hardened, but no one cared enough to notice for long. Samuel rose from his chair with effort and extended a fountain pen toward Grace. Then perhaps you should sign something for once. She accepted the pen. The metal felt heavier than expected. She signed her name carefully on the acceptance line, each letter steadying as it formed. Grace Miller. For a moment no one spoke. Then Hawthorne, who had served the Whitmore household for 32 years without visible emotion, began to clap once. Slow. Respectful. Naomi joined him. Then Chun. Then Sloane. Soon the room filled with applause that sounded nothing like charity galas. It sounded earned. Grace's eyes burned unexpectedly. She blinked the feeling back. Eleanor stepped near enough to speak privately, but not presumptuously. Miss Miller, she said, voice low and clear. I cannot undo how I treated you, but I will spend what remains of my influence trying to undo what I ignored. Grace studied her. Pride had not vanished. It had been replaced by responsibility, which wore better. Then start with breakfast, Grace said. Your kitchen staff has been working all night too. Hawthorne's mouth nearly became a smile. The room relaxed for the first time since midnight. But before anyone could move, Samuel glanced at the window where media vans now lined the road beyond the gates. He looked back at Grace and said, Director Miller, it appears your first press conference has arrived. Director Miller, it appears your first press conference has arrived. Samuel Reed's words drew every eye toward the front windows where satellite vans and black SUVs now lined the road beyond the gates. Camera crews moved through the morning mist, jackets zipped against the cold, lenses already pointed at the mansion that had hosted champagne 12 hours earlier and accountability by sunrise. Grace Miller looked down at the acceptance letter still in her hands. Ink drying. Life-changing. She had entered this house carrying towels. Now reporters waited outside for her name. I cannot do that dressed like this, she said, glancing at her housekeeping uniform. The room laughed softly, not at her, but with relief. Eleanor Whitmore stepped forward. Yes, you can. Grace looked up. Eleanor's expression held no performance now, only certainty. Do not change clothes for people who never change their character. Even Samuel nodded at that. Mr. Hawthorne cleared his throat. The front terrace is covered, ma'am. Podium can be set in 3 minutes. Do it, Eleanor said. Then she turned to Grace. I will stand behind you if you permit it. Grace considered the request. Once, standing behind Eleanor would have meant disappearing into service. Today it would mean something else. You may stand beside me, Grace answered. A quiet breath moved through the room. Eleanor accepted it with a small nod, as though receiving a lesson she intended to keep. Minutes later, the terrace doors opened and cold, clean air rolled inside. Rain had passed. The sky above the estate was breaking into pale blue strips between retreating clouds. Water still clung to hedges and stone railings, catching sunlight in bright points. Cameras snapped the moment Grace stepped outside. The sound startled her more than thunder had. Reporters called names, questions, accusations, guesses. Hawthorne guided her to a simple podium placed beneath the covered archway. Samuel stood to one side, Naomi Brooks and Margaret Sloane to the other. Eleanor Whitmore walked out last and took her place half a step behind Grace, exactly where Grace had allowed. The cameras noticed everything. Grace gripped the edges of the podium. Her hands were steady. She remembered buses before dawn, late rent notices, customers who looked through her, managers who mispronounced her name because correcting them felt expensive. She remembered her grandmother saying, "Speak plain when truth is on your side." So she did. "Good morning," Grace began. The crowd quieted immediately. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. "Last night, an elderly man asked me to protect an envelope. I did not know what was inside. I only knew he was scared, and two men wanted it more than they wanted him safe." Cameras clicked faster. This morning we learned that envelope contained evidence connected to families who were misled, displaced, and ignored. Many of those families believed no one with power would listen. They were right for too long. Naomi lowered her eyes, moved. Grace continued. "Today that changes. A restitution fund is being created. Independent reviews begin immediately. Records will be opened. Names will be named. Homes and dignity matter more than signatures on glossy paper." A murmur spread through the reporters as assistants typed furiously. Someone shouted, "Are you replacing Mrs. Whitmore?" Grace answered without hesitation, "No. One replaces accountability. It has to be practiced." Even Samuel smiled at that one. Another voice called, "Mrs. Whitmore, were you involved?" Eleanor stepped forward only enough to be seen. "I was negligent, proud, and blind where I should have been vigilant. That is enough involvement for one lifetime. I will cooperate fully." The honesty stunned the crowd more than denial would have. Grace felt the energy shift. Scandal had come for spectacle. It was receiving repentance instead. Another reporter shouted, "Miss Miller, how does it feel to go from maid to executive overnight?" Grace paused. The old reflex to soften herself rose, then passed. "I was never just a maid," she said. Silence fell hard and complete. "I was a worker, a granddaughter, a citizen, a woman paying attention. If more people paid attention to workers, fewer executives would need replacing." The terrace erupted and shouted questions. Hawthorne nearly smiled again. Samuel leaned closer and murmured, "That line will cost several people sleep." Grace almost laughed. She answered 3 more questions, all plainly. No rehearsed jargon. No decorative sympathy. Then she stepped away from the podium. Reporters kept calling after her, but the moment was already complete. As the crowd churned, Grace turned and saw kitchen staff gathered quietly inside the glass doors, aprons on, coffee cups in hand, watching. Housekeepers, line cooks, drivers, groundskeepers, people who usually entered through side doors. Their eyes were shining with a pride too private to perform. Grace walked to them first before any board member or camera. She hugged the dishwasher who had lent her bus fare once. She thanked the prep cook who always saved leftovers for late staff. She took both hands of Mrs. Alvarez from laundry and kissed her cheek. No cameras followed quickly enough to fake that scene. Behind her, Eleanor stood alone for a moment on the terrace, watching workers receive the woman she had once ordered around. Then Eleanor quietly removed the diamond bracelet still on her wrist and handed it to Naomi Brooks. "Auction it," she said. "Brookhaven Roofs first." Naomi nodded once. Hours later, after statements, signatures, investigators, and departures, the mansion finally grew quiet. Sunlight filled the long hallway where the night had begun. Grace walked through it carrying no towels, no tray, no fear. At the entrance, she paused beside the brass plaque that read Whitmore Estate. Hawthorne approached holding a small screwdriver and a new engraved plate. He looked at her with rare warmth. "Where would you like this mounted, Director Miller?" Grace read the plate. "Community Recovery Office." She smiled softly. "Not here," she said. "Put it downtown, where people actually need to see it." Then she stepped outside into the bright morning, and behind her the great house stood silent, learning at last how small it had been.